there were three large movements of Indians. The first one being in 1830 when they had, again, the Policy or Removal Act, the law. The government passed the law and they moved all the Indians east of the Mississippi to the west. And that was all kinds of upheavals, and that's when the Indian Territory was formed. And the idea of the government then was to put all the Indians in that particular territory. And that went sort of well up until the point when they ran on to the Indians up in the northern plains, and there was a different story up there. You know, they couldn't get them to move. So that was a change in that policy. But that was the first big movement of Indians en masse. They moved them sometimes by gunpoint, and other times with the army, you know, with army escorts, of course. That's how all the southern Indians, southeastern Indians got to be Oklahomans, you know. So they carried a whole new different experience into Oklahoma. Then the second one was the Second World War, when a lot of American Indians went into the army, both men and women. Probably about 40,000 soldiers, you know, were American Indians in the Second World War, and they located them, or they situated them right with the regular troops. They didn't segregate them, so they fought right alongside with the white soldiers in all the battles. And then during the war also they had, on the West Coast, they had a lot of, and in different parts of the country, they had war industries going on and building ships and airplanes and other things. So a lot of Indian women went out to work in the war industries during that period, particularly here on California, in the West Coast, starting down in Los Angeles all the way up to Vancouver, Washington. They had shipbuilding. That caused another big shift, yeah, big shift. And there would be kids, I noticed back at the Indian school on the reservation, they would just disappear, you know, and all of a sudden their parents moved to, you know, someplace out there, and then after the war they came back. It was interesting, because just that little piece of absence changed them to some degree. They weren't as, they had to kind of fit back in again to the society. Very different. Then the third one, of course, was this one, you know, the urban relocation program.
So as a little girl, we lived on, before we relocated, we lived on a ranch on the reservation in a little place called Lenore, Idaho. And I remember as a little girl, you know, playing in the wheat bins, plucking chicken, seeing snake skin on the front of our porch, you know, in the morning.
We decided that we will go on relocation. We left about 3 in the morning, headed out, and it was in February 1960. Got down to Redding and it was hot. We'd been wearing sweatshirts, you know, it was cold. And by the time we got to Mount Shasta, we had shed the sweatshirt, wearing t-shirts, and we saw this big orange, didn't know what it was. And it was a place where they made real orange juice. We'd never had that before. That was brand new to us.
But I remember my dad took me to the bus. I got on the bus, it was a Greyhound bus, and I rode the bus from South Dakota to San Jose. And I remember getting off the bus in San Jose, and I could have kissed the ground. I was so happy to be here.
Yeah, you know, that was one of the drawbacks for relocatees, particularly Indian people, was that they didn't have work experience, you know, that allowed them to kind of figure out what work was there and what was available and how to get to it.
We had never ridden a bus before, so our guidance counselor from the Bureau of Indian Affairs had to teach us how to ride a bus. We didn't know how. They had to teach us how to use a phone, because we didn't have phones. There were no phones at home on the reservation.
But I was always lonely. I think that's the biggest obstacle that I had. I know other relocatees had their wives and children. When you come out, you're the only one, you don't know a soul in California. I mean, it was quite an experience because you didn't know anybody.
We had an urban population here in San Jose. We had one in Oakland and then one in San Francisco. So there was, in the Bay Area, there was a fairly large amount of Indians that had come in that period in the 60s. And of course, Alcatraz happened then during the 60s. And then of course we had, following that, we had Wounded Knee. So Indians sort of got on the screen in that particular period. Individually, it was a big change for, I think, in terms of trying to, as you've seen yourself as an Indian, because most of the previous ways we were seen was not that good. You know, we didn't have much attention, and we were sort of seen as much of the, I think, the myth or the things go about Indians, and thus we never seen ourselves really much as a particular ethnicity. You know, one thing you lose, obviously, is you lose your own culture in fitting in, because, you know, 70–80% of the day, 90% of the day, you're out amongst other people, whatever aspects work. And that changes person.
And there was a lot of, you know, different color people. There was blacks, there was Mexicans, there was myself or our family. And I knew I was Indian. And my parents, my stepdad was very friendly, and we got to know a lot of other Indian families in the area that may have come out from our same reservation, or they came out from Oklahoma, you know, from the Choctaw tribe. But I remember going to a lot of different, you know, events as a child at the San Francisco Indian Center. You know, we went to Halloween parties, little gatherings and things like that.
With the Asians, once they found out that we were Native American, then they accepted us real easy and said that some of their ways are like ours. And with the Mexicans, they'd say, well, you're like our brother, you're like our sister.
But we knew we were just different. I didn't quite know. I knew Indian, but I didn't know quite what that meant yet, other than from the history books that we were taught in 4th grade, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. So I started learning a little bit about that. So at that, when I was 10 and under, I had no clue what Indian meant, you know. As I got older, as a teenager, I kind of would flow into the culture of more Hispanic. I'm also half and half, so kind of went with that flow. So in our neighborhood, I lived at King and Story. There was only maybe the blacksmiths. They were the only other family that I knew of. Mm. Yeah, and I met them at the Indian Center, so that's as much as I knew. A lot of the language my grandma spoke with my mom. Only spoke it basically when me and my brother were doing bad things or whatever, out of line, and so they'd speak it, and we look at each other, well, we're in trouble. What are they saying? You know, my grandma and my mom would be speaking Indian, mm-hmm. And so after that's where it was lost. She didn't have no one to speak to anyway.
I identify with who I am. I can't be anything else but who I am. And you know, I've always been an Indian. And that's one of the problems, like to me, where they become issues and things in California. They find out who I'm an Indian, and it starts out being okay, and all of a sudden they have all these jokes, you know, and they can get pretty hard sometimes. And you had to overcome a lot of that, you know, like woo, 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 and stuff like that. Hey, Chief, you know. So I got used to people calling me Chief. And I said, well, don't ever call me late for lunch, but you know. So I kind of laughed and I rolled. To be accepted, you got to go through a lot of things, especially we're a minority within a minority. And
when they moved the Indians to the cities, he said they thought that they would lose their Indianness. He said, and it worked just the opposite. Once they came to the cities, they became more Indian, much more aware of their Indianness, and so it just reversed on the idea of them losing their identity. One of the policies of the Bureau at the time was not to, you know, when you knew that there was someone here from your tribe that was in the city, but they wouldn't reveal their address to you. They didn't want you to get in touch with them. For what reasons, I don't know, but that was one of the things. So But in the cities, what kind of the informal places that opened up and was the center of information was the bars. There was a couple of Indian bars. And there's one that still exists right up here on San Fernando Street. That was sort of a collect point for Indians. So if you went there and talked to somebody, you could find out who was here and who wasn't here and going on. So they played that part.
At the same time, I drank like a fish too. I was a young, never realized it was complicating into a form of alcoholism. That later on I straightened that out, but it took me through some experiences, you know, jail, you know, drunk driving, and some things you had to go through in life to learn to get your path straight. Well, July 2nd, 1971, I quit drinking. And it's coming on 45 years.
Downtown San Jose was very active at that time. I mean, it was huge. Active people in the streets. It was a regular downtown city. That's where we met fellow Native Americans. We went to the bars, yeah, but we didn't go and get drunk every time. It was our way of socializing. So we would go and listen to music, you know, and the guys would play pool. And then at that time they had Western bars where they had Western bands. So everyone would go to the Western bands and just dance and, you know, have a good time. So that was our way of that was our families and all our friends. And I've known most of these people the whole time I've been here, the entire time.
So a bunch of them got together and started golfing. And I hadn't paid attention to this until Brian, our son, mentioned to me. He says, you know, Mom, I learned a lot more about Indians than I think if I'd been at home. What are you talking about? He says, well, when the Indian golfers would come over to the house and I'd fix dinner or lunch, whatever for them, they'd start talking. And he said the Sioux would talk about what they did. He said the Choctaws would talk, and Paiutes, and everybody would talk about back home. And he said, I learned more about different tribes. We had some people from Alaska. We all learned, or he did. I'm sorry, he did. Well, we did too. And he said, you know, everybody shares their stories and there's always laughing going on. And he said it was great. He said, I like that. And he said some of these guys, they ended up being like an uncle.
I never knew that there were California Indians. I always figured, I heard of the Pawnee and the Navajo and the Apache, but I never knew that there was all these tribes like the Miwok and, you know, all the Costanoan. I never knew they existed. And they said, yeah, we've got to do something, man, you know. And but a few weeks later, they took Alcatraz over in 1963. Wasn't in 68. It's the first occupation was 63. It was the Russell Means and his family and the Codiers and 4 Lakota families jumped the fence. It wasn't until, what, 5 years later or 6 years later, that's when the main occupation hit. But I remember talking to Russ the following week after they got off the island there. I said, hey, man. I said, how was it out there? Because they were on the San Francisco Examiner, you see the feathers and they were jumping the fence, you know. He said, man, he said, those goddamn white boys, they could have that damn place. It's cold out there. We about froze our butts off. He said, really? He said, yeah, it was cold.
I'm one of the few people that was at Alcatraz when it was declared American Indian land. Just by chance I would be there and be invited to that. So it was sort of 69, I believe, just after I moved to California. So it was sort of a starting point for me to get reacquainted with my heritage. And then after that, I started selling pottery that came from my reservation as a way of getting the word out there. I had a jewelry store in Hayward. I sold one of the few places you could find beadwork and quill work in the Bay Area. So many years back. And then started going to powwows.
We found there were powwows down here. Well, let's go. And you look around and, don't I know you? We ended up, a lot of us ended up, formed a club, and it was just a get-together. It ended up being more like family, like we'd made up our own tribe.
So we would go to the powwows and help them with their Indian taco stand because they needed help. I mean, they didn't have enough people, so we would go. But it was very small powwow at that time. But that was a lot of fun too, and that was another way of carrying on the traditions.
I was very active in sports. I played basketball and football and ran track and field, and I boxed when I was a young kid and played baseball. I tried to emulate anything Jim Thorpe, this little kid with these dreams, that one day I want to be a major league ball player, and that's why I was so fascinated with seeing Candlestick Park. It was just like a shrine, like seeing the Taj Mahal or something. Wow, you know, I'm here. You know, I pinch myself. You know, things that kept me out here was institutions like that. I kept going, and why I stayed this long, you know, in those early days, you know, I just didn't want to go home. I had that drive in me that I figured when I wanted to go home, I'd think about who's around there anymore. You know, they're either going to college or they join the service, or you know, they're employed around there, and do I want to go back? So I was, the first half a year while I worked out here, I always saved $45, enough for a ticket back to Rapid City, South Dakota. Well, South Dakota is you know, it's my home, but it's got a lot of prejudice too, a lot of racism yet. And because we're the largest minority, I don't like to use that word, but we're the largest people of color group, then you know, our target, we got targets on our back.
I just couldn't fit back at the reservation. I didn't have any good friends anymore. The ones I had were drinking. I mean, they were alcoholics. They would borrow money from me so they could drink, and I could tell they were killing themselves because but there's nothing to do on the reservation. There's nothing. You can't even go to a movie. You know, there's nothing there. So they all become depressed and they drink, and now they're doing drugs. Everyone's into drugs. But I just didn't feel good there.
And then after hanging out in California, I was getting more open-minded, changing my views about my worldview, you know, about theology and about churches and about rights of the human being, and it kind of, you know, a different understanding, I guess, and this is all what never happened. It wouldn't come about with relocation when that happened. I would be probably stuck in South Dakota doing shouting hallelujahs in a church somewhere.
We've all become one nation living in California. That's what I think. We're not Navajos, Eskimos, Sioux, you know, Nez Perce. We're all, I really feel like we're all one nation. That's why when we go to the Stanford powwow, it makes you feel so good because we're all one. It doesn't matter what tribe you are. And that comes from depending on each other, you know, and forming our own little communities here and our own families.